I'd like to start by taking you back to an April evening in 1895 when a 20-year-old University of Nebraska student named, a 20-year-old University of Nebraska student attended a performance in Lincoln by the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, which was then touring what were, at that time, the Western states. The orchestra was there to share the latest cultural wonders with the people of Lincoln. And this student, an aspiring writer named Willa Cather, was especially excited because she had never before heard an orchestra perform a piece of music. Raised in a tiny prairie town called Red Cloud, 150 miles from nowhere, Cather was a daughter of the American frontier. All her life, she had mixed emotions about the land of her childhood. It was beautiful, but barren, populated by poor, struggling, ignorant farmers and mechanics, many of them immigrants seeking a better life, and many of them found it beyond their grasp, and yet they never seemed to lose their idealism. As she later described a character in one of her novels, she felt as if her heart were hiding in the land somewhere with all the little wild things. Under the long, shaggy ridges, she felt the future rising. Now, the symphony that Cather heard that night changed her life forever. It resonated in her soul like nothing she had ever imagined. The music conveyed something vast and sublime, and yet simultaneously homely and comforting. This was not mere entertainment. This was a revelation. She later likened it to losing her virginity. Two parts of the symphony struck her with particular force. The second movement, called the Largo, sounded to her like, quote, a song of homesickness, the exile song of many nations. And the unusual conclusion of the symphony felt like, quote, an aspiration, like the flight of the dove over the waste of waters. What she was listening to was the brand new symphony by the Czech composer Antonín Dvořák. Known to scholars as his Symphony No. 9 in E minor, Dvořák had given it a special title, writing on the cover of the manuscript, From the New World. This symphony, which premiered in December 1892, was destined to become one of the most celebrated compositions of all time, according to a 2009 poll, the most popular symphony ever written, and among the finest expressions of what we now call the American dream. But just as the American dream is a universal dream, one that all humanity can share, so Dvořák's New World Symphony has, for over a century, gone beyond borders to express some of mankind's greatest ideals. To appreciate this symphony in all of its splendor, we have to start with the question of why a 52-year-old bohemian musician would travel to the United States to write music about America to begin with. And to answer that, we have to start with the immense transformation of human life in the late 19th century. The 40 years after the American Civil War revolutionized human existence. During this period, social, political, and technological changes ushered in a world barely recognizable to people only half a century before. This marked the maturing of capitalism, which, now that slavery was vanquished, began shining the light of liberty across America and the world. Consider the inventions of this era: the light bulb, audio recording, the telephone, the internal combustion engine, the typewriter, the bicycle, barbed wire, corrugated cardboard, the ballpoint pen, the toothpaste tube. Steam and gas started to replace wood-burning stoves. Indoor plumbing became commonplace. Skyscrapers began reaching for the clouds. Wooden ships were succeeded by vessels made of steel. And, of course, there was the railroad, the most important technology of the age. The Transcontinental Railroad was finished in 1869, and within a decade, new refrigerated rail cars were transporting food thousands of miles, including to the 9 new states that were admitted to the Union during this period. If you were my age in 1900, you had been born into a world lit and warmed by fire, transported by horse and wind power, built of stone and wood. And now you lived 100 feet in the air in a building made of steel and lit by electricity. You rode trains to far-off cities and conversed by wire with people in other states. 3 years later, you could fly. This transformation was especially noticeable in two rival cities, New York and Chicago. In the 1830s, Manhattan's population was around 300,000, and Chicago was a frontier fortress with 250 people living in it. 50 years later, in 1880, there were 1.7 million New Yorkers and 500,000 Chicagoans. Almost everything that we think of as quintessentially Manhattan was more or less created between 1865 and 1900. The American Museum of Natural History, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Central Park, the first elevated train, the Metropolitan Opera, the Brooklyn Bridge, the Statue of Liberty, the first skyscraper, the New York Public Library. Chicago's transformation was even more dramatic. The Union Stockyards, an engineering marvel, was established in 1864, and by 1890, it housed 9 million cattle, prepared for slaughter and transportation to far-flung villages across North America. A tremendous fire in 1871 destroyed 3 square miles of the city, more than 17,000 structures. And yet Chicagoans had rebuilt with amazing rapidity and then began working to reverse the course of the Chicago River to eliminate a terrible sewage problem. In 1900, they accomplished it, one of the greatest engineering feats of all time. The Monadnock Building, still the tallest brick structure in the world, was finished in 1891. But a year before that, the first steel frame building was completed, the Rand McNally Building, which revolutionized architecture and made possible Chicago's legendary skyscrapers. In 1889, the greatest building of the era was completed, the Chicago Auditorium by Louis Sullivan and Dankmar Adler. The largest building in America, the first in the Windy City to be lit by electric lights. Its austere outside concealed a glorious interior. Unlike most theaters of the time, audiences entered into an almost Spartan lobby, only to rise up the stairs into a breathtaking hall bathed in the ethereal gold of electric light and ornamentation almost mesmerizing in its beauty. The building was so gorgeous that it won Chicago the greatest prize of all. It, not New York, would host the 1893 World's Fair, officially known as the World Columbian Exposition. That exposition, one of history's most important cultural events, was a kind of opening fanfare for what everybody knew would be a new age for mankind. The fair marked the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the New World, although due to technical problems, it opened a year late. Its organizers were emphatic that it should mark the New World's answer to the Paris Fair of 1889, where Europeans had unveiled one of the great wonders of the age, Gustav Eiffel's 1,083-foot-tall steel tower, the tallest man-made structure ever built. The organizers of the Chicago Fair wanted to prove that America could top that America had grown up. But, of course, New York City was not going to let Chicago hog all of the glory. Its cultural leaders decided to offer their own celebration of America's maturity. And one of the people responsible was a remarkable patroness of the arts named Jeanette Thurber. Thurber's great dream was to establish a school of music that would rival the great academies of Europe. But she did not want to simply imitate German and Italian schools. She dreamt of helping create a distinctive indigenous form of musical expression, one that would express a uniquely American spirit. At the time, musicians and critics were engaged in heated debates about what it meant for music to be national. Was such a thing even possible? Could orchestras and singers articulate a nation's cultural identity? Whatever the answer might be, Thurber wanted Americans to rebut the dominance of German and Italian musicians, and she wanted her new school to be open to all students, including women and members of racial minorities who were often excluded from such opportunities in the United States. So when she established her National Conservatory in 1885, she announced that it would be open to anyone of talent, regardless of race, sex, or ability to pay. Yet she knew that her new school would need a prominent musician to lead it, and the world's greatest composers were, of course, in Europe. Thus, she began searching for a composer willing to come to America for a few years' residency to teach and to write new music with a specifically American character. That was a lot to ask. Europeans still considered America a rustic land of Philistine shopkeepers and nouveau riche, and they really weren't wrong. New York was hardly Paris. But Mrs. Thurber had a very persuasive tool in her kit: money, lots of it. So, when she asked the German composer Johannes Brahms to recommend someone, and Brahms suggested his protege Antonin Dvorak, she knew just how to convince him. Dvorak was born in Bohemia in 1841, the eldest son of a butcher who had 13 other children. He proved to be a prodigy on the violin, even composing a polka at the age of 14. His family had little money, and it was hard to persuade the father to let him pursue a musical career, but Antonin's teachers were sure enough of his potential that they overcome his father's reluctance, and in the 1850s, after graduating from music school, Antonin began playing in a traveling dance band, teaching piano lessons and composing serious orchestral works in his spare time. It took 20 years, but he began to gain recognition as a composer. And this was largely due to the influence of Brahms, who discovered Dvorak through some competitions that Dvorak entered, on which Brahms had served as a judge. Brahms especially admired Dvorak's Hungarian dances and Slavonic dances, two pieces in which Dvorak adapted traditional folk songs into artistically respectable music, something that perfectly suited the goals of those who wanted to create national musical styles. Dvorak had a flair for understanding, expressing, and elaborating upon the essential qualities of folk songs without just copying them or imitating them, and critics began to respect his work. That attention, of course, meant years of labor. During the 1870s and 1880s, Dvorak traveled back and forth across Europe, coordinating with orchestras, composing dozens of musical pieces, and teaching classes at the Prague Conservatory. All of this drudgery, however, only earned him a modest salary to support his wife and 9 children. So, when Mrs. Thurber appeared with her offer of $15,000 per year, 25 times his present salary, how could he refuse? But it wasn't just about the money. Dvorak was fascinated by the social and technological transformations taking place in the United States, and he wanted to see them for himself. He particularly loved boats and trains. In fact, his favorite hobby was touring ships and sitting at train stations to watch locomotives fly past. Just months before he arrived in America in September 1892, the New York Central set the world speed record with a train that traveled more than a mile a minute. And within a year, the company announced that one of its trains had broken the 100-mile-per-hour barrier, becoming the fastest thing ever to travel on land. In America, Dvorak eagerly indulged his passion for boats and railroads, dragging his assistant to the docks almost every day. There was soon not a boat that we had not inspected from stem to stern, the assistant later said. When a ship was due to sail, we went there and watched it from the shore until it was out of sight. If it happened that the master was engrossed in his work at home and forgot about the departure of a boat and there was no longer time to go to the harbor, we went to Battery Park and from there followed the ship. Examining trains was more difficult because station managers would not let people on the platform without a ticket. It was in vain that we begged the porter to let us look at the American locomotive, the exasperated assistant recalled. So we traveled all the way to 155th Street, a good hour from the master's house, and there on a bank waited for the Chicago or the Boston Express to go by. It took up a lot of time, nearly the whole afternoon. Actually, Dvorak had toyed with the idea of writing music on American themes for many years. In his youth, he had read a book by an American writer that he admired so much, he dreamt of someday making it into an opera. That book was The Song of Hiawatha by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Longfellow was born in 1807 and became America's first professional poet, that is, the first poet who was able to make a living from his writing. Although literary critics sneered at him in later years, he was actually a brilliant innovator and the creator of immortal verses that Americans still cherish today. Many of his poems focused on the quiet joys of home and family, celebrating what we now call the bourgeois values of domestic life. But he was also a serious literary scholar who wanted to bring world culture to American readers, so he translated Dante's Divine Comedy into English, and he also composed his own epic poems about the people and history of the New World. One of these was the Song of Hiawatha in 1855, a work that he hoped would be to Americans what the Odyssey is to the Greeks. Hiawatha was based on an actual Ojibwe legend about a warrior, the son of the west wind, who falls in love with the beautiful Minnehaha, only to lose her to a terrible famine. To capture a feeling of Native American life, Longfellow used an unusual poetic meter, which gives the poem a hypnotic drumbeat quality, as if the lines are being chanted around a campfire. In some passages, it depicted intoxicatingly lovely images of bucolic America. Round about the Indian village spread the meadows and the cornfields, and beyond them stood the forest, stood the groves of singing pine trees, green in summer, white in winter, ever sighing, ever singing. Song of Hiawatha was immensely popular and was translated into many other languages. As Christoph Irmscher puts it, many Europeans, in a sense, discovered America through Longfellow's lines. But many Americans themselves discovered Native American culture through Longfellow's poem, or more accurately, their own stylized, romanticized version of it. Song of Hiawatha exerted such a powerful influence over how non-Indians thought about Indian life that to this day, many cultural stereotypes about indigenous Americans are traceable to the beauty and dignity of Longfellow's work. It's fashionable today to scorn art like this as appropriation and so forth, but that's unfair to Longfellow, who was trying to honor the noble qualities of his native hero and underscore the fact that these qualities are universally admirable, regardless of one's race. In any event, although Dvorak never did write his opera, the spirit of Longfellow's poem would infuse his New World Symphony. Another major influence on the symphony was the music of Black America, what were then called Negro songs or Negro spirituals. On this point, Dvorak was probably influenced by his students at Mrs. Thurber's Conservatory, especially a 26-year-old black singer from Pennsylvania named Henry Burleigh. Born in 1866 to a Civil War veteran, Burleigh had worked a variety of odd jobs before being admitted to the conservatory as a singer and bass player. When Dvorak asked him to sing, he performed several spirituals, including Go Down Moses and Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, and Dvorak was transfixed. In an interview published 2 months after his arrival in New York, he said that Negro spirituals, quote, must be the real foundation of any serious and original school of composition in the United States. That seemed obvious to the composer. After all, he had already written many successful pieces based on Czech and Hungarian folk songs. But it was controversial in America. When newspapers published his comments, several critics denounced him. One Boston writer called him a Negrophile. Others insisted that American culture had more in common with European culture and that music born on the slave plantation could hold nothing of value for white Americans. True, black musicians at the Chicago World's Fair had just invented a new musical style that they were calling ragtime, but ragtime struck sophisticated critics as vulgar, a mere fad. Dvorak, however, was resolute that America's cultural diversity must be the source of its music. Quote, the germs for the best music lie hidden among all the races that are commingled in this great country. When it is accomplished, another wreath of fame and glory will be added to this country which earned its name Land of Freedom by unshackling her slaves at the price of her own blood, end quote. As a self-made man who had himself risen from poverty to world fame, Dvorak likely felt a kinship with the spiritual's tone of earnest expectation. Decades after Dvorak's death, Henry Burleigh remarked that black musicians would always honor him for recognizing, quote, in the songs of the plantation, proof of the Negro's spiritual ascendancy over oppression and humiliation, and understanding their message that eventual deliverance from all that hinders and oppresses the soul will come, and man, every man, will be free. Now, all these changes and controversies were swirling in the background when 20-year-old Willa Cather sat in the audience in Nebraska on April 18, 1895, to see conductor Theodore Thomas take the stage. Although Cather had never heard a symphony before, she probably knew that symphonies consist of 4 movements, typically a fast opening movement, followed by a slow second movement, then an upbeat dance-like third movement, and then a final fast movement. Maybe she had heard the rumor that Dvorak made some last-minute changes to the score, that a friend persuaded him to slow down the second movement a little more to make it more melancholy. Now, as the violins begin to play, she notices it's in a solemn minor key, which musicians use to convey a sense of longing or wistfulness. That's followed by a 2-note fanfare on the horns, and then woodwinds that make the opening moments seem like the sunrise over a broad river. Suddenly, a sort of announcement, a burst of sound, and a theme begins to rise from the horns. It becomes more prominent, a sort of triangular rising and falling figure, and it begins to seem as if one has emerged from an ocean fog into a vast new landscape full of grand forests and sunlit river valleys. Ever since its premiere, listeners have claimed to detect various Negro spirituals in the music that follows. Yet Dvorak never actually quotes any of them in any noticeable way. And it's kind of amusing that writers who are convinced he copied from black music have never agreed about which exact songs he's supposed to be imitating. Is it Roll, Jordan, Roll, or Swing Low, Sweet Chariot? The reality is that Dvorak didn't borrow directly from any source. Instead, he had a unique capacity for grasping the sense of life that's expressed in these songs and creating new music that articulated the same spirit, the spirit of defiant resistance in the face of injustice, of confidence in ultimate triumph, of the will to persevere, of the spirit of vindication that has made this music such a cherished part of the American repertoire. The actual music here is entirely Dvorak's own, but it evokes the same sense of reaching for freedom that animates the greatest spirituals, and which in the American tradition is often associated with the country's great rivers. This is the music of independence. Now the second movement is about to begin. Since its premiere, this piece, known as the Largo movement, has become one of the most cherished of American tunes. In 1922, one of Dvorak's students, William Arms Fisher, even wrote lyrics for it and converted it into an imitation Negro spiritual called Goin' Home. But it seems more likely that Dvorak was trying to convey the spirit of the Midwestern prairies and drawing from Longfellow's Song of Hiawatha. Hiawatha is an elegy. Like so much writing in the noble savage tradition, it's a romanticization that takes Native Americans as a symbol to represent what many Europeans wanted the New World to be. And here, Dvorak could write from personal experience because in the summer of 1893, he took a 1,000-mile train ride from Manhattan to a small village in northeastern Iowa called Spillville, which had been founded 30 years earlier by Czech immigrants. Dvorak spent 3 months there exploring the Great Plains. A great deal of empty space, he wrote to a friend. A farmer's nearest neighbor is often 4 miles off, especially in the prairies. I call them the Sahara. There are only endless acres of field and meadow, and that is all you see. This quaint village could not have been more different from New York City. With its vast open horizon and its melting sunsets, it likely reminded Dvorak of the pastoral scenes from Hiawatha. The Largo movement of Dvorak's symphony combines the bucolic countryside of Longfellow's imagination with the gentle beauty of the Iowa cornfields and the dreams of Spillville's immigrant farmers who were proud of the modest prosperity that they had built themselves and their families. It starts with quiet, introspective horns, which create a frame for the soloist. The solo is performed on an obscure instrument called an English horn, which scholars think Dvorak chose because it sounded like Henry Burleigh's singing voice. What has made this movement so appealing to so many people is Dvorak's skill at capturing the atmosphere of home and family. With its calm tempo, its warm autumnal tones, one can almost see a farmhouse with smoke rising from the chimney. It brings to mind the biblical phrase that George Washington liked to quote as his definition of the American dream: "Everyone shall sit under his own vine and fig tree, and none shall make him afraid." The third movement is entirely different. It's a whirl of energy and excitement with rapid-fire strings. It's messing up here. It's a whirl of energy with rapid-fire strings and booming drums. Is it the booming of the drums from the Song of Hiawatha? Is it the explosive power of Niagara Falls, which Dvorak stopped to see on his way from Spillville to New York? Or is it the Chicago World's Fair, which he also stopped to visit? The fair was then boiling with thousands of visitors. Over 750,000 visited on a single day, there to see the fantastic White City with sculptures by Daniel Chester French and Buffalo Bill's Wild West show featuring authentic Indian warriors. But actually, it's more likely that Dvorak's inspiration was the railroad. When he visited the Chicago Fair, Dvorak almost certainly stopped by the fabulous Transportation Building built by Louis Sullivan, the same architect who had designed the Chicago Auditorium. Behind its famous golden door were the newest locomotives, including the one that had allegedly reached 100 miles per hour only months earlier. Here in the third movement of the symphony, you can hear the thrill and rush of blasting through the landscape, racing through tunnels and over mountains on ribbons of steel at a locomotive's top speed. This section is followed by a somewhat more peaceful passage, likely inspired by the steamships that Dvorak liked to watch sailing off to the horizon. You can even hear the ship's bells. Hear the bells? At last, the final movement. Now here, Dvorak summarizes everything that's gone before and, in a bold step that is unusual for a symphony, even introduces new themes, as many as 6 in this single concluding movement. They interact and fold over each other in a demonstration of musical inventiveness that seems to celebrate America's racial and cultural diversity. This is the music of a dynamic society, one rooted in equality and freedom. It's the music of a bustling new world of explosive possibilities. Now, America's cultural diversity and dynamism astonished Dvorak. He wrote home about seeing the magnificent Statue of Liberty, which was then only 10 years old, about his fascination with the country's cultural and racial variety. Quote, "Here in America there are towns and villages of all nations under the sun," and he added 2 exclamation points. Immigrants were indeed flooding into the country, about 12 million between 1870 and 1900, 70% of them through New York City. Only 9 months before Dvorak arrived, federal officials opened a new facility to receive these immigrants called Ellis Island. Dvorak's 4th movement seems to revel in the harmony and diversity of the American melting pot. But perhaps the most ingenious moment of the symphony is yet to come. Most symphonies come to a resounding conclusion that resolve the themes into a single point and then signal the conclusion to the audience. But Dvorak's ending is far more introspective, perhaps even ambiguous. The New World Symphony began with a few hesitant notes, and it ends not with hesitation, but with a sense of wondrous trepidation about what this new world offers to mankind. It seems to say that as glorious as the future might be, it could also hold great danger, and only the choices that we make can determine the outcome. At first, the music seems to approach a typical crescendo, like something Mozart or Brahms might write. But then it pauses and folds back upon itself and offers us a denouement with the French horns, a sound of hope on the horizon like the evening star. And then it rises a second time into a final trembling drama. This is unlike any symphony ever written. And here, too, Dvorak seems to have been inspired by Hiawatha. As you listen to these concluding notes, I want you to think about these words from Longfellow's poem. "Yes, it is the sun descending, sinking down into the water. All the sky is stained with purple, all the water flushed with crimson. No, it is the red swan floating, diving down beneath the water. To the sky its wings are lifted, with its blood the waves are reddened. Over it the star of evening melts and trembles through the purple, hangs suspended in the twilight." This sounds like it should be the end, right? Sounds like you should be ready to applaud any second, right? No. When young Willa Cather heard these final notes, she was stunned. This was more than a concert. This was what she imagined life could mean and ought to mean. There was all the hope of the new world in it, she wrote. Dvorak had captured her own sense of life and that of her fellow audience members in the evanescent and abstract way that only music really can. In fact, the experience struck Cather so profoundly that she made it into a pivotal moment in a novel that she published 30 years later. The main character is an opera singer named Thea, based on Cather herself, who grows up in a poor farming village on the Great Plains. When a local music teacher arranges for her to take singing lessons in Chicago, she moves to the big city. One day, Thea goes to hear the orchestra perform. On the program, of course, is the New World Symphony. But it's noteworthy that Cather sets this scene not in the small Nebraska theater where she actually heard it, but in Louis Sullivan's phenomenal Chicago auditorium. There, the golden splendor of Sullivan's architecture and the heavenly sound of Dvorak's music light a fire in Thea that she feels she must preserve forever, even if it requires defying the world. Cather's writing in this passage is so impassioned and beautiful that I must quote it at length. When the first movement ended, Thea's hands and feet were cold as ice. She was too much excited to know anything except that she wanted something desperately. And when the English horns gave out the theme of the Largo movement, she knew that what she wanted was exactly that. Here were the sand hills, the grasshoppers, the locusts, the reaching and reaching of high plains, the immeasurable yearning of all flat lands. There was home in it, too. First memories, first mornings long ago, the amazement of a new soul in a new world. A soul that was new and yet old, that had dreamed something despairing, something glorious in the dark before it was born. When the symphony was over, she sat still, scarcely knowing where she was. When she emerged from the concert hall, a furious gale was beating over the city. The streets were full of cold, hurrying, angry people running for streetcars and barking at each other. There was some power abroad in the world bent upon taking away from her that feeling with which she had come out of the concert hall. Everything seemed to sweep down on her to tear it out from under her cape. If one had that, the world became one's enemy. People, buildings, wagons, cars rushed at one to crush it under, to make one let go of it. Very well, they should never have it. They might trample her to death, but they should never have it. As long as she lived, that ecstasy was going to be hers. She would live for it, work for it, die for it, but she was going to have it. Time after time, height after height, she would have it. What the trumpets were singing, she would have it. Now, I suspect some of you have had a similar experience at some point. Maybe it was a piece of music, or maybe it was something else, a sculpture, a painting, a novel, that struck you so intensely that it seemed like a burst of light into a realm that you hadn't even known was dark, or like an answer to a question you'd always somehow been asking. That is art's great power, its capacity to transport us to a realm where things seem fundamentally right. Willa Cather's generation had emerged from the poverty and drudgery of farm life. They had been brought to the threshold of liberty by immigrant parents or enslaved grandparents. And now, in the 1890s, they witnessed not just economic growth, but the birth of an essentially brand new civilization, things humanity had never experienced before: electric light, motion pictures, skyscrapers, steel production increased by a factor of 500 in their lifetime. The amount of railroad track quadrupled, farm output doubled. This was the moment when what Columbus called the New World produced upon the earth something genuinely new, a society where the infinite potential within each person was unleashed to irrigate the deserts and fertilize the plains and cure the diseases and construct the machinery to liberate mankind from the toil under which every one of our ancestors labored. Louis Sullivan, the architect of the auditorium building, said that this was the instant, quote, when the golden hour tolled, all mists departed, and there shone forth a vision, the reality of man as free spirit, as creator, as container of illimitable powers for the joy and peace of mankind. The Ninth Symphony was the sound of that golden hour. And yet Dvorak's symphony was not just embraced by Americans. The spirit of hope that Cather cherished so passionately was shared by people worldwide in the years to come. One of these was the novelist and adventurer James Norman Hall. Hall was born in Colfax, Iowa in 1886, and he went to school at Grinnell College. One day in 1907, he was walking to the library to study for a philosophy exam, and he happened to hear music coming from the chapel. It was a professor playing the New World Symphony on the organ. In less than 2 minutes, I was wrapped away from any further thought of philosophy, he wrote 5 decades later. As I listened, the doors swung apart, revealing what was indeed a new world to me. The music sounded like the landscape, but idealized, spiritualized, of the earth and not of it at the same time. When World War I broke out, Hall became a fighter pilot and was shot down by the Germans, spending the war's final months in a POW camp. When peace came, he moved to Tahiti and co-wrote the novel Mutiny on the Bounty, which was made into an Oscar-winning movie in 1935. A few years after that, he was walking past a hotel in Papeete when he heard Dvorak's New World Symphony coming from the building. Inside was the hotel's owner, a Czechoslovakian emigre named Mr. Rivnak, who was playing the music on his record player. Hall asked if he could listen too, and soon the men became fast friends, sitting evenings together listening to Rivnak's records. But as the decade ended, Rivnak grew increasingly despondent about the rise of Adolf Hitler, who was trying to annex much of his homeland. In 1939, when the British government caved in to Hitler's demands, handing Czechoslovakia to the Nazis, Rivnak was devastated. Hall wrote, "He was sitting in his stout chair, and I could see no outward change, except that instead of his usual greeting, he gave me a barely perceptible nod. Presently, I took my courage in my hands. I went to the shelf and took from it the record we loved so much, and set it to play the fourth movement. It was then night in Europe, night in a double sense in Czechoslovakia, but we were not aware of it. It was as though I were hearing a new fourth movement, a never-failing spring of living water to give refurbishment, solace, new powers of endurance under the cruelest blows of fate. It seemed to me that Dvorak was speaking now for and to his homeland." To Hall and his despairing Czech friend, the New World Symphony seemed like, quote, "the most inspiring of unfulfilled prophecies and at the same time, by implication, the most heartbreaking commentary in advance on the history thus far of the 20th century." During the war that followed, there were others who found in Dvorak's New World Symphony the fuel that they needed to keep the light of hope alive. In 1942, a group of British civilians were captured and imprisoned by the Japanese army on the island of Tabuan in the East Indies. Imperial Japan's cruelty to its prisoners is infamous, and the case of the Tabuan prisoners was no different. Abused, starved, beaten, and humiliated, they struggled to retain their sanity and dignity. The guards allowed them to hold religious services and to sing hymns, so a group of prisoners asked if they might hold a concert. The guards agreed, but the prisoners had no musical instruments. So they came up with an unusual idea. They would hum and vocalize to mimic the sounds of an orchestra. After practicing for several days, they invited the other prisoners to their show. "This evening," declared the group's leader, "we are asking you to listen to something quite new, a choir of women's voices trying to reproduce some of the well-known music usually given by an orchestra." And together, the group began to perform the Largo movement of Dvorak's New World Symphony. "I felt a shiver go down my back," recalled one prisoner, a woman named Helen Colleen. "It sounded ethereal, totally unreal in our sordid surroundings." Although puzzled at first, the guards themselves soon began enjoying the music, and eventually the prisoners were holding regular concerts. "The music renewed our sense of human dignity," Helen said. "We had to live under bestial conditions, but by Jove, we could rise above them." She and her sisters were freed when the war ended. Almost 4 decades later, one of her sisters found among her papers the booklet in which she had written the notations for the singing parts. In 1995, a Dutch choir used these crudely written sheet music to record the Tabuan prisoners' vocal orchestration of Dvorak's Largo movement. In Song of the Lark, Willa Cather had written that Dvorak's symphony expressed something so precious that she would live for it, work for it, die for it, but never give it up. The Tabuan prisoners felt that fierce devotion to a better world in a way that Cather could never have imagined. There are many other tales of the way that Dvorak's vision has touched people, but I want to end with just one more. Less than a decade after World War II ended, a 22-year-old Korean War veteran from Ohio decided to join the marching band at Purdue University, where he was now studying engineering. He played the trumpet and the piano, and he performed in a jazz band in high school. But one of the pieces he learned for the Purdue band was Dvorak's classic symphony. His name was Neil Armstrong, And 17 years later, when the crew of Apollo 11 was allowed to select some music to bring along on their mission to the moon, Armstrong selected two recordings. One was a groovy science fiction jazz record called Music Out of the Moon, and the other was Antonin Dvorak's New World Symphony, which therefore became the first symphony ever played on an actual new world. Did Dvorak succeed in creating a distinctive American national music? Well, in one sense, no. After all, after he left America in 1895, only a handful of composers really built on his example. None of them became America's Richard Wagner. On the other hand, his influence may be much more profound than it seems. His endorsement of black music lent vital credibility to singers such as his student Henry Burley, who went on to become a composer himself and the nation's leading black vocalist. In 1941, when he was 83, he sang at a ceremony to honor Dvorak's legacy. Dvorak's other students, Will Marion Cook and Reuben Goldmark, did not become equally famous, but they went on to become teachers themselves, and their students were Sidney Bechet, Eubie Blake, Duke Ellington, Aaron Copland, and George Gershwin. By then, the ragtime piano style that had been born at the World's Fair in 1893 had evolved into jazz, which in the hands of these musicians became the truly American musical art form. It was just as Dvorak had predicted. Still, music cannot really give voice to a national spirit or stop at national boundaries. It's too abstract for that. Rather, From the New World embodied Dvorak's impressions of America. It evokes not any particular ethnic or political identity, but broader human longings. It expresses the sense of life born of opportunity, the chance to accomplish great, bold, unprecedented things, to set oneself against the odds and triumph, as well as the calmer pursuits of the household, the freedom to raise a family, to enjoy one's own home, to enjoy the fruits of one's labor in peace. This freedom to pursue happiness would later be called the American dream, but of course, these desires are not confined to Americans. They are the aspirations of all mankind. What makes America special is that at its best, it liberates these aspirations and opens the door for those willing to come through. When Willa Cather published the novel in which Dvorak's symphony changes her character's life, she chose for the cover a painting by a French artist named Jules Adolphe Breton. Painted only 8 years before Dvorak's symphony premiered, it depicts a poor young girl standing barefoot in a cornfield. She could be an ancestor of any one of us, your grandmother, your great-grandmother. She holds a sickle ready for another day of hard manual labor. But she's also ready for something else. Behind her, the morning sun begins to spread the new rays of a hopeful dawn. The girl looks up, not down, towards the rising light. Recognizing a kinship between the painting and the New World Symphony, Cather borrowed Breton's title for her novel, calling it The Song of the Lark. The lark, of course, sings at daybreak. To my mind, this is the sense of life that Dvorak managed to capture, the moment of dawning opportunity, the glimpse of the potential for triumph, of the chance to prevail that has always been the New World's greatest gift. This was the song of the New World. Thank you very much. We have 10? Okay, good. We've got 10 minutes for questions. That's plenty. All right, let's start.
How long did it take Dvorak to write the symphony, and what do we know about his creative process?
So we don't really know how long. Dvorak finished at least the draft on which he wrote From the New World, he finished in about 3 months. which is remarkably fast. He also, I should say, Dvorak wrote a large number of works while he was in the United States. He wrote a string quartet, a string quintet, the so-called American Suite, and a piece called The American Flag that nobody listens to anymore. He did a composition that was based on various spirituals and things. He orchestrated a version of Swanee River. So he did a lot of other works. My own theory is that he did the first draft of For the New World, then went to Spillville and changed it while he was there. But that's just my speculation. I don't think scholars have any real idea. Yeah.
So some of the sections of the second movement you played really reminded me of Howard Shore's Lord of the Rings soundtrack, and some of the fourth movement really reminded me of Ennio Morricone and other 1960s film music. So how much do you know about the other composers he influenced and the influence he had on later music?
Let's see if I can do this here. So yes, Dvorak has been very influential to other composers over the years. I want to play, if I can, I want to play for you. Take this off so I can play it over my phone. The openings, just the opening moments of the fourth movement, and see which two movies immediately come to your mind, okay? Let me try that again. Rewind it here. Jaws, right? Now, right, Star Wars. Yeah, so Dvorak has been very influential, and of course the Largo movement, the homely, going home movement has been so incredibly influential. Almost every Hollywood movie that wants to show you down home on the farm, in the background they'll be playing something either modeled on or literally copied from Dvorak's second movement. So he's been incredibly influential.
Thank you. One of the taglines of this conference is "Fuel Your Soul." And this talk definitely delivered for me.
Good, thank you.
I'm wondering, did he talk explicitly about blending these influences of the prairie and the city? Did he make it a point?
He did not.
No.
So Dvorak did not write any kind of artistic manifesto or explanation or anything of that sort. Now, we get from his letters and from the memoir that was written by his secretary that I quoted from, and a biography written by his son. So we know what he did, and we know that what he was interested in. We know he probably saw Buffalo Bill's Wild West show at the Chicago Fair. And when he was in Spillville, there were Indians who would come and perform their dances for him in Spillville. And some of the mementos that they gave him are on display at the museum, the Billy Clocks Museum in Spillville, Iowa, that you can go to. So we know that he heard this music, but beyond that, it's speculation. If you listen to the American Suite, which was originally composed for piano, so listen to the piano version of it. It was later orchestrated. Listen to the piano version of it, and the last part of it, you're like, you can hear the ragtime. But we don't know for sure that he really did listen to ragtime or imitate it, right? So it's sort of detective work on our part. Yeah.
I have long been impressed by your ability to pull imagery and identify what you feel when you speak about Dvorak and your other pieces in TOS. I'm curious about your interpretive process. Like, how do you go about doing that? Do you take several rounds of sitting through a piece? When you listen, do these things just automatically come up for you?
No, so here's try and give my advice for living here. So I like to pull the threads. So when I first encountered Dvorak actually through Willa Cather's novel. I was reading Willa Cather's novel because an anonymous person on the internet recommended it to me and said it was the great American novel. And that was a good selling line for me. So I tried it, and it probably is. It's a fantastic novel. And when I read the passage about the New World, I said, I got to listen to this, right? Listen to that, and then I was curious about it to find further research, books on it, what the influences were. If there's a footnote that refers to another book, go get that. If there's a mention of a painting that has a similar title, go look it up and that sort of thing. So one of the important ideas about, and this is in the broader theme of living a better life, one of the important ideas to have in mind about pursuing happiness is that learning how to pursue happiness is a skill. Happy people don't just sit back and experience things and say, oh, that was nice. What they do is they say, I really like that. I want to know more about it. I want to pursue it. I want to track it down. Where does it come from? What other things are in that vein that I might also enjoy, that sort of thing. And so that's kind of what I did to put this together, for example, or my other talks, is what are the influences on this? Who else has been influenced by this? And what you find is, in history, there are these groups of people who connect with one another. You know, that Duke Ellington's teacher was a student of Antonin Dvorak, and the fascinating connections between these things, I never get tired of them. And the pursuit of that is kind of the pursuit of happiness. Aristotle says that happiness is the activity of the soul in conformity with virtue. The emphasis there needs to be on activity. Anyway.
Thank you for the analysis. I think through this lecture, I've found the symphony to be, in Ayn Rand's words, a very romanticist work.
Yes.
And I would say I find the opposite. I would find, there's also the opposite, the natural, how shall I put it? And I find that there are genres that fit into also the opposite, the opposite idea. And I think the equivalent of naturalism in music would be things like, off the top of my head, minimalism. It is people like Philip Glass, etc.
Yeah, sure.
I absolutely detest, and these are things that are written not because so Dvorak really tried to represent the ideal America in his heart with the instruments, whereas in minimalism, the things are written because they can be written. There is no volition.
Yeah.
Nothing is trying to represent.
So I would agree with that. Now, I would say, Dvorak is a romantic composer in the historically speaking. He's influenced by people like Wagner and others, and what he's doing, but he is influenced by real life things. So he's taking, the music of Indians or Negro spirituals, and he's stylizing them and adapting them to express a spirit, a sense of life, as opposed to, well, I would say there's two kinds of naturalism in music. There's actual noise music, that the avant-garde, John Cage kind of crap. And then there's the minimalism, as you describe. The one that comes to mind is Bear McCreary, the film composer, who must be paid $1 million per note, because I think his music consists of a single note at a time.
Morton Feldman.
Just unlistenable as far as I'm concerned. It doesn't progress anywhere. It doesn't seem to do anything. So, yeah. Next.
It seems so. Today, I feel like I don't often hear music that attempts to capture the broad spirit of an age. Does this sort of thing exist today?
I think so. I think it does, but I think it's in film music. So we mentioned that John Williams is heavily influenced by Dvorak. Another name that comes to mind, we were talking about this yesterday, another name that comes to mind is my favorite film composer, Jerry Goldsmith, whose famous compositions are things like the soundtrack to Star Trek, the motion picture, or the soundtrack to Rudy. Have you ever seen the film Rudy with Sean Astin? The music in that movie is just phenomenal. There are these composers out there who are still making music in this vein. Unfortunately, or I don't know, maybe it's fortunate, they are stuck in Hollywood. And as a result, they tend to be writing incidental music, which is not very easy to listen to and enjoy just on its own, usually. Although they do write a lot of stuff on the side. I mean, these composers do write, concerti and symphonies and things like that. But you got to look for them. In today's world, the good art is so much drowned out by that bad art that you really do have to, as I said, follow the threads to seek out and find the good art out there. And you will find it. There is a lot of good art. This is word to the wise, my objectivist friends. You often have this attitude like all art just went to pot in 1917 maybe, and that just, or maybe a little Art Deco, but after that, there's nothing good in the late 20th, nothing good in the early 21st century. That's just not true. There's lots of good art out there. It's just it doesn't get the attention from the so-called cultural gatekeepers that it ought to get. So don't rely on the gatekeepers. Go out there and find it for yourself, and you will find that there is quite a lot of it. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.